In the summer of 1943, history held its breath. On a small section of the Soviet-German front known as the Kursk Bulge, Hitler gathered all the might of the Third Reich for a final decisive blow. The latest Tiger and Panther tanks, elite SS divisions, thousands of aircraft. Everything was thrown into Operation Citadel. They marched to avenge Stalingrad and turn the tide of the war. But a surprise awaited them. Soviet intelligence knew their every move. An unprecedented fortress of mines and trenches had been erected in their path. What really happened on the field near Prokhorovka? And how did the Wehrmacht's last hope turn into its greatest disaster? Today, we will tell the story of the battle that determined the outcome of World War II. The spring of 1943 on the Eastern Front was deceptively quiet. After the resounding defeat at Stalingrad, where Paulus's entire Sixth Army perished in an icy cauldron, the front line froze for a time. It curved in a bizarre arc around the city of Kursk, wedging itself 120 kilometers deep into German positions and reaching 200 kilometers in width. This protrusion, facing west, became a symbol of the unresolved issue, a point on the map where the further fate of the entire war would be decided. For the Soviet Union, it was a springboard for a future offensive. For Germany, it was a painful thorn in the side and, at the same time, a tempting opportunity for revenge. Both sides, exhausted by the winter campaign, were gathering their strength. The air was thick with the tension that precedes a storm. It was not just a lull, it was a pause filled with the clanging of metal in the factories, the rumbling of trains heading to the front, and the quiet, concentrated work of the headquarters. In Berlin, Hitler demanded that his generals regain the initiative. After the humiliation of Stalingrad, the Third Reich needed a resounding, indisputable victory to demonstrate to the world and its own people that the German war machine was still capable of winning. The victory at Kursk was supposed to not only even out the front, but also psychologically break the Red Army, make the Allies doubt the strength of the Soviets, and maybe even push them into separate negotiations. In the Kremlin, Stalin and his generals knew that the summer campaign of 1943 would be decisive. After Stalingrad, there was a radical turning point, but it was not yet irreversible. One powerful blow from the Wehrmacht could throw the Red Army back, wiping out all the successes achieved. Therefore, the entire country, from the Urals to the front lines, worked for future victory. Industrial giants, evacuated to the east, increased the production of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Every day, new divisions, artillery regiments, and tank corps arrived at the Kursk Salient. It was a race against time, a race for resources, a race of intellects. The German command saw the Kursk Salient as an ideal trap. The plan seemed classic and elegant. Two powerful converging strikes at the base of the salient. From the north, from the Ural area, and from the south, from the Belgorod area. As a result, huge forces of the Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts were to be surrounded. It seemed that this would be a repeat of the triumphant cauldrons of 1941. But this was no longer 1941. The Red Army had learned a lot. It had learned to fight, it had learned to endure, and most importantly, it had learned to anticipate. An era of battles not of attrition, but of extermination was dawning. And the Kursk Bulge was becoming the epicenter of this coming clash of titans. The world held its breath in anticipation. Everyone understood that here, on these fields of Central Russia, it would be decided whether the Soviet Union would survive and when exactly the Third Reich would fall. This lull was the last breath before the battle that would forever go down in history as the greatest tank battle of all time. The idea of revenge for Stalingrad had been in the air at the Führer's headquarters since the beginning of spring 1943. However, the German generals were divided on how exactly this revenge should take shape. The tempting Kursk Salient lay before them, but how to approach it? It was here, amid arguments and doubts, that Operation Citadel was born. The main proponent of an immediate strike was Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group Center. Together with General Kurt Seitzler, chief of the General Staff of the Army, he insisted on a classic solution: to cut off the salient with powerful converging strikes before the Red Army had time to properly fortify itself. They saw this as a chance for quick and decisive success that would restore the strategic initiative. Their plan was bold and straightforward. However, this idea had an influential opponent. Erich von Manstein, Field Marshal, commander of Army Group South, and perhaps the most talented strategist in the Wehrmacht. Manstein, the author of the famous Kharkov counterattack that stabilized the front after Stalingrad, proposed a completely different concept. He believed that a frontal attack on prepared defenses, even weak ones, would lead to huge losses and would not guarantee success. Instead, he proposed a so-called swinging hammer, or cornering attack. Manstein's plan was to deliberately allow Soviet troops to launch an offensive from the Kursk Salient, draw them deep, and then deliver powerful flanking blows to their stretched communications, trapping them in a massive cauldron. It was a risky but potentially much more effective plan, relying on tactical skill rather than brute force. Hitler hesitated. He was torn between the desire for immediate revenge, which Seitzler supported, and the more subtle game proposed by Manstein. But there was a third force influencing his decision: industry. Armaments Minister Albert Speer reported that the latest technology was about to arrive at the front: heavy Tiger tanks, medium Panther tanks, and Ferdinand tank destroyers. These machines, he said, were to become the wonder weapon that would give the Wehrmacht qualitative superiority on the battlefield. Hitler, who always had a soft spot for technical innovations and gigantism, was fascinated by this idea. He believed that a few hundred new tanks could break through any defense. In the end, this fascination with technology played a fatal role. Hitler decided to postpone the start of the offensive. First from April to May, then to June, then to early July. He wanted to wait until enough Panthers and Ferdinands arrived at the front. This decision was a fatal mistake. Every day, every week of delay worked against Germany. While in April the Soviet defenses were still relatively weak, by July the Kursk Salient had become the most powerful and multi-layered fortress in military history. Thus, the final plan for Operation Citadel, approved by Order No. 6 on April 15th, was a compromise that satisfied no one. It was a straightforward plan devised by Kluge and Seitzler, but its postponement completely deprived it of its main advantage: the element of surprise. Manstein had to obey and prepare for a frontal attack, the success of which he did not believe in. The operation, born in doubt and postponed because of faith in a technical miracle, was doomed before it even began. One of the main reasons Hitler delayed Operation Citadel was his almost mystical belief in the new generation of German armored vehicles. He believed that technological superiority could compensate for the Red Army's numerical advantage. In the summer of 1943, the Wehrmacht rolled out its new gladiators onto the fields near Kursk, iron monsters that were supposed to be the battering ram that would crush the Soviet defenses. The main hope was the heavy tank PZK-PFW-1, better known as the Tiger. It was a veritable mobile fortress. Its 100mm thick frontal armor was virtually invulnerable to all Soviet tanks and anti-tank guns of the time at standard combat ranges. And its own 88mm KWK-36 gun, based on the legendary anti-aircraft gun, could hit any Soviet tank, including the T-34 and KV-1, from a distance of more than 1.5 kilometers. The appearance of the Tiger on the battlefield shocked Soviet tankers and gave rise to Tiger phobia. However, this monster also had its weaknesses: low speed and maneuverability, enormous fuel consumption, and most importantly, extreme complexity and high cost of production and maintenance. By the beginning of Operation Citadel, the Germans were able to concentrate only about 130 Tigers on the Kursk Bulge. The second new weapon on which huge hopes were pinned was the PZKP-ABW Panther medium tank. The Panther was a direct response to the Soviet T-34. It had sloped armor, which increased its resistance to shells, and a powerful 75mm long-barreled gun that surpassed the T-34 in terms of armor penetration. Based on its overall characteristics, armor, armament, speed, many experts consider the Panther to be the best medium tank of World War II. But it had a disastrous debut at Kursk. The 200 Panthers sent to the front were completely unfinished. They suffered from numerous technical malfunctions, especially in the engine and transmission. Most of them were disabled not by enemy fire, but by breakdowns. Many tanks caught fire while on the march, without even entering combat. Their hasty introduction into service proved to be a colossal mistake. The third wonder weapon was the heavy tank destroyer Ferdinand, named after its creator, Ferdinand Porsche. It was an impressive machine, built on the chassis of the Porsche-designed Tiger, which had not been accepted into service. The Ferdinand, or Elephant, as it was later called, had 200 millimeters of impenetrable frontal armor and the same powerful 88mm gun as the Tiger, but with a longer barrel, which made it even more deadly. 90 such vehicles were assembled into a single battalion and sent to the northern front. They were indeed almost invulnerable from the front and inflicted enormous damage on Soviet tanks. But the Ferdinand had one critical flaw: it lacked a machine gun. This made it completely defenseless against infantry in close combat. Soviet soldiers, letting these giants pass through their positions, set them on fire with Molotov cocktails and blew them up with grenades. Thus, the German wonder weapon turned out to be a double-edged sword. Yes, the Tigers and Ferdinands were formidable opponents, but there were too few of them, and they were not without flaws. And the Panthers, the main hope for a massive qualitative reinforcement, were not ready for battle. Hitler's faith in technology, which made him postpone the operation, did not pay off. The iron monsters were strong, but there were not enough of them to break through the wall that the Red Army had built for them. While German generals argued about timing and strategy, and engineers feverishly finalized new tanks, in Moscow, in Stalin's office, strikingly accurate intelligence reports were landing on the table. In the spring of 1943, the Soviet command knew virtually everything about the impending German offensive: its direction, objectives, the composition of the strike groups, and even the expected date. This unprecedented awareness was one of the key factors that determined the outcome of the battle. Where did this information come from? It was the result of a complex, multi-level intelligence system. One of the most important sources was the famous intelligence network operating in Switzerland under the leadership of Sandor Rado, known by the code name Dora. Within this network operated one of the most valuable agents in history, Rudolf Rössler, who was referred to in reports as Lucy. Rössler, a German anti-fascist, had access to information from the very heart of the German High Command. There is still debate about who his sources were, but the accuracy of the information he passed on was phenomenal. It was from Lucy that details of the Citadel plan, including the numbers of the divisions that were to take part in it, were sent to Moscow. Another equally important channel of information was the British Allies. Thanks to Project Ultra, British intelligence was able to crack the codes of the German Enigma machine. which the Wehrmacht used for secret communications. This gave them access to a huge amount of operational information. Although the British were extremely reluctant to share this data with the Soviet side, and did so only in small doses, fearing that their source would be revealed, key information about the preparations for a major offensive in the Kursk area still reached Moscow. Churchill personally sent warnings to Stalin about the concentration of German troops, but the most valuable and up-to-date information was provided by frontline and military intelligence. Reconnaissance groups regularly crossed the front line, captured tongues, enemy soldiers who had defected, and conducted surveillance. Reconnaissance pilots photographed German airfields, railway junctions, and troop concentrations on a daily basis. Partisans operating behind enemy lines reported on the movements of all German echelons. All this information flowed to the General Staff, where it was analyzed and compiled into a single, frighteningly clear picture. On April 12th, 3 days before Hitler signed the official order to launch Operation Citadel, Deputy Supreme Commander Marshal Georgy Zhukov presented a report to Stalin. In it, he outlined the enemy's plans with remarkable accuracy and proposed the only correct solution. Zhukov wrote that he considered it inadvisable for our troops to go on the offensive in the coming days in order to forestall the enemy. It would be better to wear down the enemy on our defenses, knock out their tanks, and then, bringing in fresh reserves, launch a general offensive to finally defeat the main enemy group. It was a risky plan. It required enormous courage to give the initiative to the enemy and allow him to strike first. Many in the Soviet command, including the commander of the Voronezh front, Nikolai Vatutin, insisted on a preemptive strike. But Stalin, usually inclined toward offensive action, this time showed rare restraint and fully supported the point of view of Zhukov and Chief of the General Staff Vasilevsky. A fateful decision was made, not to attack, but to defend. To meet the German steel ram with pre-prepared, deeply echeloned lines. To turn the Kursk Salient into a giant grave for the Wehrmacht's tank divisions. Knowledge is power, and in the spring of 1943, that knowledge was entirely on the side of the Red Army. After Stalin made the strategic decision to meet the German attack in defense, titanic work began on the Kursk Salient. In 2.5 months, from April to early July, Soviet troops and the local population turned this land into the most powerful and sophisticated fortification system in world history. It was not just a line of defense, it was a gigantic, multi-layered trap designed to engulf, exhaust, and bleed the Wehrmacht's strike forces. The work was carried out on a colossal scale. More than 300,000 civilians, mainly women, elderly people, and teenagers from Kursk, Oryol, Voronezh, and neighboring regions were mobilized to build the defensive lines. Day and night, under the threat of air raids, they dug the earth. In total, about 5,000 kilometers of trenches and communication passages were dug, enough to encircle the entire front line from Barents to the Black Sea. The depth of the defenses was unprecedented. It reached 190 kilometers. The entire territory was divided into 8 defensive lines. The first 3, the main, second, and army defense lines, were the strongest. Behind them were the rear lines. Each line consisted of a system of strong points that were prepared for circular defense and connected to each other by trenches. But the main element of this deadly trap was anti-tank obstacles. The Soviet command understood perfectly well that the Germans would rely primarily on their tank wedges. Therefore, the main task was to separate the tanks from the infantry and direct their movement into pre-prepared fire pockets, where concentrated artillery awaited them on the flanks. For this purpose, gigantic minefields were created. The density of the mines was incredible, up to 2,500 anti-tank mines and 3,000 anti-personnel mines per kilometer of front. In total, more than 500,000 mines were laid. The sappers showed remarkable ingenuity, setting up surprise mines and false minefields to confuse the German sappers. In addition to mines, huge anti-tank ditches were dug, escarpments, steep cuts on slopes, and counter-escarpments were created. Tank traps, hedgehogs, and wire barriers were installed in tank hazardous areas. All bridges were prepared for demolition. The entire Kursk Salient was transformed into a single engineering barrier. Particular attention was paid to camouflage. Firing points, artillery batteries, command posts, and even entire tank brigades lying in ambush were carefully concealed from German aerial reconnaissance. Hundreds of false targets were created. Fake airfields with model aircraft, false artillery positions, and even false tank columns to mislead the enemy about the true location of Soviet forces. All this gigantic work to create a trap was carried out in the strictest secrecy. The Soviet command managed not only to create a defense of unprecedented power, but also to conceal its true scale from the enemy, as well as the concentration of huge strategic reserves in the rear, which were to enter the battle at the decisive moment. When German tanks launched their attack on July 5th, they did not advance on the usual line of defense. They entered a carefully prepared labyrinth of death, where every hill, every ravine, and every meter of ground was ready for battle. The night of July 5th, 1943, was stifling and restless. The silence was broken every now and then by distant explosions. Soviet scouts were trying to pin down the enemy's positions. The German offensive was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the morning, but the Soviet command decided to strike first. At approximately 2:20 a.m., thousands of Soviet guns and Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed a barrage of fire on German positions. This preemptive artillery preparation had more of a psychological than a material effect. It did not inflict serious damage on the German troops, who had already left their original positions, but it sowed chaos and confusion, disrupted communications, and showed the Germans that they were being waited for here. With a delay, at about 5:30 in the morning, Colonel General Walter Model's 9th Army began its offensive on the northern face of the Kursk Bulge. Its main objective was to break through to Kursk via the town of Olkovatka. Model threw about 300,000 soldiers, nearly 1,000 tanks, and self-propelled guns, including that very battalion of the latest Ferdinand tanks, into the battle. He was opposed by the troops of the Central Front, under the command of Army General Konstantin Rokossovsky. Rokossovsky, one of the most talented Soviet commanders, positioned his troops with brilliant foresight, concentrating his main forces precisely in the direction of Model's main attack. From the very first minutes, the fighting took on an incredibly fierce character. German tanks, supported by aircraft and artillery, rolled wave after wave toward the positions of General Pukhov's 13th Army. But they encountered a deeply echeloned defense saturated with anti-tank weapons. Tigers and Ferdinands fired their powerful guns at Soviet tanks from long distances, but as they advanced, they were blown up in minefields, caught in flanking fire from camouflaged anti-tank guns, and fell victim to tank-destroying infantry. Particularly heavy fighting took place in the area of the Ponyry Station, which the Germans called Stalingrad of the Kursk Bulge. This small settlement changed hands several times. Here, German equipment could not use its advantage in firing range and got bogged down in street fighting, where Soviet infantry and artillery were particularly effective. The Ferdinands, deprived of machine guns, proved extremely vulnerable here. Müller threw more and more reserves into battle, trying to break through the Soviet defenses. After 5 days of continuous fighting, his army, at the cost of enormous losses, managed to wedge itself into Rokossovsky's defenses by only 10 to 12 kilometers. It was a complete failure of the Blitzkrieg. The German plan was to break through to Kursk in 2 or 3 days. Instead, The Ninth Army got bogged down in the first line of Soviet defenses, wasting most of its offensive potential. Rokossovsky skillfully used his reserves, counterattacking on the flanks and preventing the Germans from widening the breakthrough corridor. By July 10th, the offensive on the northern flank had virtually stalled. Model was forced to order a transition to defense. The northern claw of the Citadel broke against the steel will and skill of the Central Front troops. The Wehrmacht suffered heavy losses in personnel and equipment here, failing to accomplish its mission. While on the northern flank of the Kursk Bulge, the Wehrmacht's offensive encountered stubborn, impenetrable defenses from the outset. Events in the south unfolded much more dramatically. Here, in the direction of the main strike, the German command concentrated its best forces, elite SS tank divisions and Army Corps equipped with the latest technology. Their goal was to break through Oboyan to Kursk. On the morning of July 5th, after powerful artillery and air preparation, General Hermann Guderian's 4th Panzer Army and Army Group Kempf began their offensive. They were opposed by the troops of the Voronezh Front under the command of General Nikolai Fedorovich Vatutin. Unlike Rokossovsky, Vatutin was unable to accurately determine the direction of the main German attack and was forced to spread his forces across the entire front. This meant that the Soviet defenses at the tip of the German tank wedge, which was being driven forward by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the 48th Panzer Corps, were not as dense as in the north. The Germans threw huge amounts of equipment into the battle. Hundreds of tanks, including new Panthers and Tigers, supported by assault guns and Junkers 87 dive bombers, began to break through the first line of defense of General Chistyakov's 6th Guards Army. The fighting became incredibly fierce. Soviet soldiers and artillerymen fought with desperate courage. One of the bloodiest battles of the first day took place on the heights near the village of Cherkaskoye. Wehrmacht and SS battalions launched more than 10 attacks during the day, but each time they were pushed back, suffering huge losses. The ground was littered with burning tanks and bodies of soldiers. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, using their numerical and qualitative superiority in equipment on a narrow section of the front, the Germans managed to break through the main line of defense to a depth of 10 to 12 kilometers. This was an alarming but not catastrophic result for the Soviet side. Vatutin began hastily transferring reserves to close the breach. It was on the southern flank that 200 new Panther tanks made their debut. And this debut, as already mentioned, was a failure. Most of the vehicles were disabled due to technical malfunctions. However, those Panthers that managed to reach the battlefield demonstrated their superiority, hitting T-34s from long distances. The fighting did not let up for a minute. Despite their losses, German tankers stubbornly advanced, seeking to break through to the second line of defense. Soviet troops responded with fierce counterattacks. Voronezh Front Commander Vatutin was constantly on the front lines, trying to stabilize the situation. His staff worked under incredible pressure, making decisions that would determine the fate of the entire battle. By the evening of July 5th, it became clear that a critical situation had developed on the southern flank. German tank wedges, despite suffering heavy losses, continued to advance toward the heart of the Kursk Salient, the city of Oboyan. The entire burden of the ensuing struggle fell on the shoulders of the tankers of General Mikhail Katukov's 1st Tank Army, who had to stop this steel torrent. The most dramatic stage of the battle on the southern flank of the fiery arc began. Breaking through the first line of defense, General Gota's strike force rushed along the Belgorod-Oboyan highway, straight towards Kursk. It seemed that the way was open, but standing in their way was the 1st Guards Tank Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Mikhail Yefimovich Katukov, one of the strongest and most experienced tank formations of the Red Army. It was Katukov who was tasked with preventing the Germans from breaking through to the 2nd and then the 3rd line of defense. Katakov was a master of defensive warfare. He understood perfectly well that engaging in a head-on collision with superior German tanks, especially the Tigers, would be suicidal. Therefore, he employed a tactic that would later be called mobile anti-tank defense. The essence of this tactic was not to cling to every meter of ground, but to lure German tank wedges into pre-prepared ambushes. Soviet T-34 tanks and artillery, taking advantage of the terrain, hid on the reverse slopes of hills, in groves, and in ravines. They allowed German tanks to get close, and then opened sudden fire on their flanks and rear, their most vulnerable spots. After a short fire raid, Katakov's tankers quickly changed positions, retreating to a new, pre-prepared line and set up another ambush. This tactic wore down the Germans, inflicted heavy losses on them, and slowed the pace of their advance. Every kilometer of advance cost the elite SS divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf enormous bloodshed. The battles for the second line of defense, which ran along the banks of the Peene and Seil rivers, reached an incredible intensity. German tankers, with their superior optics and long-range guns, tried to fight at long distances. Soviet tankers, on the contrary, sought to get as close as possible to the enemy so that their 76mm guns could pierce the armor of the Tigers and Panthers. These were real tank duels, where everything was decided by the endurance, skill, and composure of the crews. Particularly fierce battles took place on July 6–9. German tank regiments, suffering heavy losses, slowly but steadily pushed back Katakov's troops. General Gott threw all his reserves into the battle, seeking to break through to Oboyan as quickly as possible. At one point, the Germans managed to cross the Seil River and threatened to encircle the units of the 1st Tank Army. The situation was critical. Vatutin and Katakov brought their last reserves into battle, launching counterattacks with individual tank brigades and regiments. The Soviet tankers showed mass heroism. Often damaged, the T-34s continued to fire, turning into immobile firing points. The crews fought to the last shell, to the last cartridge. By July 10th, after 5 days of continuous fighting, the Wehrmacht's 48th Tank Corps' offensive in the Oboyan direction finally petered out. The Germans advanced 30 to 35 kilometers, but were unable to break through the defenses and reach open terrain. They lost hundreds of tanks and thousands of soldiers. Seeing the futility of further attacks in this direction, the commander of Army Group South, Manstein, decided to change the direction of the main strike and turn the tip of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps eastward toward the small station of Prokhorovka, in order to bypass Oboyan from the flank. This decision led to a new, even more grandiose battle that went down in history. July 12, 1943, Prokhorovka. This name has become synonymous with the greatest tank battle in history. For decades, Soviet historiography portrayed it as an epic clash between two steel armadas, nearly 1,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, locked in a deadly battle on a narrow strip of land. The picture was impressive. Tanks rammed each other, crews fought hand-to-hand, and the ground burned several meters deep. However, modern research based on the study of German and Soviet archives has made significant corrections to this heroic legend. The reality turned out to be more complex, more tragic, and at the same time, no less heroic. What really happened near Prokhorovka? By July 11th, after the offensive on Oboyan had stalled, the German command decided to bypass this pocket of resistance. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, and including the elite divisions Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, turned northeast toward Prokhorovka. Their task was to break through the third and final line of Soviet defenses and reach open ground. At the same time, the Soviet High Command, seeing the critical situation on the southern flank, decided to bring its trump card into play: strategic reserves from the steppe front. The 5th Guards Tank Army of Lieutenant General Pavel Alexeyevich Rotmistrov and the 5th Guards Combined Arms Army of General Jadov advanced toward the SS troops. Thus, by the morning of July 12th, enormous forces had indeed converged at Prokhorovka. However, the key point is that this was not a sudden counterattack in the pure sense. German units of the Leibstandarte Division had already taken up their starting positions for the offensive and even managed to dig in. They were preparing to attack. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army received orders to launch a counterattack against the already deployed German group. In other words, Soviet tanks attacked prepared German anti-tank defenses. This fundamentally changes the picture of the battle. The myth of 1-200 tanks also needs to be clarified. On the Soviet side, about 600 vehicles took part in the counterattack, mainly T-34s and T-70 light tanks. They were opposed by about 300 German tanks and assault guns, including about 50 Tigers and a number of captured T-34s. Thus, the total number of vehicles involved was closer to 900, which is still a colossal figure. The battlefield was a narrow corridor, 8 to 10 kilometers wide, squeezed between the Saal River and a railway embankment. This confinement deprived the Soviet tank corps of any room for maneuver and forced them to attack in waves, straight into the German positions. German tankers and artillerymen, taking advantage of their long-barreled guns, were able to shoot at the attacking Soviet tanks from long distances. The only chance of success for the Soviet tankers was to get as close to the enemy as possible in order to enter the dead zone and fire directly at them. So, by the morning of July 12th, everything was ready for the decisive battle. This was not a battle for Prokhorovka itself. It was a battle for the last line of defense on the way to Kursk. For the Germans, it was their last chance to break through. For the Red Army, it was the last line that could not be given up. Legend gave way to harsh reality, but this did not make the coming battle any less significant. At 8:30 a.m. on July 12th, after a short but powerful artillery barrage, the first wave of tanks from Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army rushed into the attack. Hundreds of T-34s and light T-77s, many with troops on board, raced across the field toward the German positions at high speed. The sight was spectacular and terrifying. However, they immediately came under heavy fire from the German defenses. Tigers and anti-tank guns dug into the ground, opened fire from maximum range. The long-barreled guns of the German PZKPF Bodydebauer tanks and Tigers pierced the armor of the T-34s. Soviet tanks burst into flames one after another, leaving trails of black smoke behind them. The losses were horrific. Despite this, the Soviet tankers continued to advance with desperate determination. Their task was to break through the zone of continuous fire and engage the Germans in close combat, where the advantage of long-barreled guns was neutralized. Those who managed to break through engaged in fierce and chaotic close-range combat. The battlefield turned into a living hell. The roar of hundreds of guns merged into a continuous hum. The ground shook from shell explosions and the movement of dozens of tons of steel. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and the smell of burning metal. In this chaos, the battle formations became mixed up. Tanks maneuvered, trying to get around each other's flanks or rear. Often, the crews of damaged vehicles abandoned their tanks and continued fighting with pistols, submachine guns, and grenades. The infantry following behind the tanks engaged in fierce hand-to-hand combat for every ravine and hill. The Soviet tankers launched attack after attack. Rotmistrov threw more and more brigades into the fray, trying to break the SS resistance. But the Leibstandarte Division held fast. Its anti-tank defenses were very well organized, and it inflicted heavy losses on the attackers. At the same time, Units of the Totenkopf and Das Reich divisions tried to advance on the flanks, which further complicated the situation. By midday, it was clear that the Soviet counterattack had failed to achieve its main objective. The Germans' defenses had not been broken, and Hauser's group had not been defeated. The price of this offensive was incredibly high. The 5th Guards Tank Army lost more than half of its tanks. Over 300 vehicles were burned or knocked out. The Germans also suffered serious losses, but they were incomparably smaller. According to various estimates, between 50 and 80 tanks and assault guns. Nevertheless, from a tactical point of view, despite the defeat, the counterattack near Prokhorovka played a decisive role in strategic terms. It completely exhausted and bled dry the best German tank divisions. They lost their ability to continue a large-scale offensive. At the cost of terrible sacrifices, Soviet tankers stopped the German armored ram. July 12th near Prokhorovka was the culmination of the entire Battle of Kursk. It was a day of incredible heroism and self-sacrifice by Soviet soldiers who, despite everything, carried out their orders and did not allow the enemy to break through. After this battle, the outcome of the battle on the southern front was a foregone conclusion. The Battle of the Kursk Bulge was fought not only on the ground, but also in the air. From the very first day of Operation Citadel, a grand air battle raged in the skies, on which the success of ground operations largely depended. Both sides threw their best air forces into battle, knowing that air superiority was the key to victory. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was still a formidable force. 2 air fleets numbering about 2,000 aircraft were assigned to support Operation Citadel. Among them were the latest Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, upgraded Messerschmitt Bf-109s, and armored formations of Junkers UU-87 dive bombers and Heinkel He-111 bombers. The Luftwaffe was particularly proud of its ace pilots, such as Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn, who had hundreds of aircraft shot down to their credit. Their task was to gain complete air superiority, destroy Soviet aircraft at airfields, and ensure the unhindered operation of their bomber and assault aircraft against ground targets. They were opposed by the Red Army Air Force, which by this time had undergone qualitative changes. New Yak-9 and La-5FN fighters entered service, which were now on a par with German aircraft in terms of performance, and in some respects, even surpassed them. The tactical skills of Soviet pilots and commanders had also improved significantly. The total number of Soviet aircraft at the Kursk Bulge exceeded that of the Germans and amounted to about 3,000 aircraft. In addition, the Soviet command actively used the Il-2 ground attack aircraft, a flying tank that struck terror into German tank and infantry columns. From the very first hours of the offensive, fierce battles raged in the sky. Dozens and hundreds of aircraft from both sides engaged in fierce combat. German Junkers aircraft, covered by fighters, attempted to bomb Soviet defensive positions, artillery batteries, and command posts. In response, Soviet fighters attacked the bombers, while Il-2 attack aircraft struck the advancing German tanks. Soviet pilots often used the Kuban Etagere tactic, developed during the air battles in the Kuban region in the spring of 1943. It consisted of staggering the fighters in altitude, which gave them a tactical advantage and allowed them to attack the enemy from above. Neither side managed to achieve complete air superiority. The battles were fought with varying degrees of success. On some days, the Germans had the upper hand, on others, the Soviet pilots. However, overall, the Luftwaffe failed to accomplish its main task, to neutralize the Soviet Air Force and ensure freedom of action for its ground forces. Despite its losses, the Soviet Air Force continued to actively influence the course of the ground battles. Il-2 ground attack aircraft inflicted heavy damage on the Germans, burning tanks and trucks and destroying infantry. They were particularly effective against columns on the march and concentrations of equipment. Soviet bombers carried out night raids on German airfields and rear bases, disrupting supplies. The air battle over Kursk was a battle of attrition. Both sides suffered heavy losses. But for Germany, which was fighting a war on two fronts, these losses were much more significant. By the end of the battle, the Luftwaffe had lost many of its best pilots and a large amount of equipment, which seriously undermined its combat effectiveness on the entire Eastern Front. Unable to gain control of the skies, the Wehrmacht lost one of its main trump cards in its last attempt to turn the tide of the war. On the evening of July 12th, as hundreds of tanks were still burning on the field near Prokhorovka, a gloomy atmosphere reigned in the Führer's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. Hitler summoned the commanders of army groups South and Center, Field Marshals von Manstein and von Kluge, to discuss the further course of Operation Citadel. By this point, even the most ardent optimists in the German High Command realized that the operation had failed. On the northern flank, Model's Ninth Army had stalled several days earlier, failing to break through even the tactical defense zone. On the southern flank, despite a deeper penetration, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps suffered monstrous, irreplaceable losses at Prokhorovka and lost all ability to continue the offensive. The plan to encircle and destroy Soviet troops in the Kursk Salient had completely failed. However, the formal reason for ending the operation was events unfolding thousands of kilometers from Kursk. On July 10, 1943, Anglo-American troops landed on the island of Sicily, opening a new front in southern Europe. This posed a direct threat to Italy, Germany's main ally. Hitler used this landing as a pretext to curtail Operation Citadel while saving face. At a meeting on July 13th, he stated that, due to the situation in Italy, it was necessary to urgently transfer part of the forces from the Eastern Front, primarily SS tank divisions, to repel the threat. Field Marshal von Kluge, whose offensive in the north had failed from the outset, immediately supported this decision. He reported that his troops were suffering heavy losses and that on July 12th, Soviet troops had launched a counteroffensive in the Oral direction, and he himself was now in danger of being surrounded. The only one who objected was Manstein. He still believed that he could inflict a heavy defeat on the Soviet troops near Prokhorovka and, at the very least, achieve a tactical victory. He asked Hitler to give him a few more days to destroy the Soviet tank reserves, which, in his opinion, were already depleted. He argued that ending the operation now, when so many forces had been committed to it, would mean a complete loss of initiative. But Hitler was adamant. The decision had been made. Operation Citadel was terminated. He ordered the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to withdraw from the battle immediately and begin its transfer to Italy. This decision was the final nail in the coffin of German offensive plans. The landing in Sicily was just a convenient excuse. The real reason for the collapse of Operation Citadel lay in the fields near Kursk. It lay in the steadfastness and courage of the Soviet soldiers, in the skill of their commanders, in the unprecedented power of their defenses, and in the enormous, irreplaceable losses suffered by the Wehrmacht. The German army threw its best divisions, its latest technology, and all of its remaining experienced tankers and soldiers into this battle. And all of this was crushed in the giant meat grinder of the Kursk Bulge. The Wehrmacht lost more than just tanks and planes. It lost faith in its ability to win. The collapse of Operation Citadel was not just the failure of a single operation. It was a strategic turning point in the entire war on the Eastern Front. From that moment until the very end of the war, Germany would never again be able to carry out large-scale offensive operations. The strategic initiative had finally and irrevocably passed into the hands of the Red Army. Hitler's termination of Operation Citadel did not mean the end of the battle. On the contrary, it was only the beginning of the end for the German armies on the Kursk Bulge. The Soviet command was just waiting for the moment when the Wehrmacht's offensive momentum would run out so that it could deliver its own crushing blows. Even before the start of Operation Citadel, the High Command had developed plans for two major counteroffensives. The first, codenamed Kutuzov, was aimed at eliminating the Kursk Salient north of Kursk. The second, Rumyantsev, was aimed at defeating the enemy's Belgorod-Kharkov group in the south. On July 12th, the very day when a tank battle was raging near Prokhorovka, Soviet troops from the Western and Bryansk fronts launched an offensive in the Ural direction. This took the command of Army Group Center by surprise. General Model, whose Ninth Army was already exhausted by unsuccessful attacks on the northern flank, was forced to hastily withdraw his tank divisions from the Kursk direction and transfer them to the north to patch up gaps in the defense. The German defenses near Ural were very strong and deeply echeloned. The fighting here was extremely fierce. Soviet troops had to literally bite their way through German positions. However, the Red Army's numerical and material superiority was overwhelming. The introduction of fresh tank armies broke the enemy's resistance. On August 5th, after almost a month of bloody fighting, Soviet troops liberated the city of Ural. On the same day, an equally important event took place in the south. On August 3rd, troops of the Voronezh and Steppe fronts began Operation Rumyantsev. After the German group on the southern flank was bled dry in battles near Oboyan and Prokhorovka, Soviet armies launched a powerful strike in the direction of Belgorod and Kharkov. Here, the offensive developed much more rapidly than near Ural. The German defenses, deprived of their best tank divisions, which had been transferred to Italy or other sections of the front, could not withstand the onslaught. By August 5th, Soviet troops had liberated Belgorod. In honor of these two significant victories, the liberation of Ural and Belgorod, on the evening of August 5th, artillery salutes were fired in Moscow for the first time during the war. 12 volleys from 124 guns announced to the whole world a radical turning point in the war. It was a salute to the soldiers who defended the Kursk Bulge and launched a decisive offensive. After the liberation of Belgorod, Soviet troops continued to build on their success. On August 23rd, after heavy fighting, Kharkov was finally liberated. This marked the end of the Battle of Kursk, which had lasted 50 days and nights. Operations Kutuzov and Commander Rumyantsev clearly demonstrated that the Red Army had completely seized the strategic initiative. It had learned not only to defend itself, but also to carry out complex offensive operations to encircle and destroy large enemy groups. The front line was pushed far to the west. The Kursk Salient, which was supposed to be a trap for Soviet troops, turned into a grave for the Wehrmacht's offensive plans and a springboard for the liberation of Ukraine. The Battle of Kursk ended in a complete and unconditional victory for the Red Army. However, this victory came at an incredibly high price. 50 days of continuous, fierce fighting on the ground and in the air claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and turned thousands of tanks and aircraft into piles of scrap metal. The exact figures of casualties are still a matter of debate among historians, but even rough estimates are staggering. According to official data, the Soviet Union lost more than 860,000 people during the defensive and offensive phases of the Battle of Kursk, of whom more than 250,000 were killed or missing in action. This is more than the United States lost on all fronts during the entire Second World War. The losses in equipment were also colossal. More than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 5,000 guns and mortars, and about 1,500 aircraft. Tank losses were particularly heavy during the counterattack at Prokhorovka, where entire brigades were burned to the ground in a few hours of attack on prepared defenses. These figures are not just statistics. Behind each of them are shattered lives, pain, and grief. But the Soviet people and their army, despite these terrible sacrifices, stood firm and won. The Soviet economy, working at the limit of its capabilities, was able to quickly make up for the losses in equipment. And by the fall of 1943, the Red Army was ready for new offensive operations. The losses of Germany and its allies were smaller in absolute terms, but for the Wehrmacht, they were truly catastrophic. According to various estimates, German troops lost about 500,000 soldiers, and officers killed, wounded, and missing in action at Kursk. About 2,500 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or knocked out. But it was not just a matter of numbers. At Kursk, Germany lost the cream of its tank forces, the best and most experienced crews who had fought their way across Europe. The elite tank divisions of the SS and the Wehrmacht, which were the main striking force on the Eastern Front, were either destroyed or suffered heavy losses. Germany was no longer able to make up for these losses in manpower and equipment. The Third Reich's industry, working under Allied air raids, was unable to produce the necessary number of new tanks, especially those as complex and expensive as the Tigers and Panthers. The loss of 2,500 armored vehicles, many of which were the latest models, was a blow from which the Panzerwaffe, the German tank forces, never recovered. The Battle of Kursk became a battle of attrition, and in this battle, the Soviet Union, with its enormous human and material resources, prevailed. Germany, having staked everything on Operation Citadel, lost not only the battle, but also its entire campaign in the East. The price of defeat for the Wehrmacht was not just lost divisions and tanks. It was the loss of the strategic initiative, the loss of hope for victory, and the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. The victory at Kursk, paid for with the blood of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, opened a direct path for the Red Army to the west, to Berlin. The Battle of Kursk, which ended on August 23, 1943, with the liberation of Kharkov, was not just another battle of the Great Patriotic War. It became a turning point, a point of no return, after which the course of history rushed in one already unchangeable direction, toward the complete and final defeat of Nazi Germany. What were the main strategic results of this grand clash? First, and most importantly, the Red Army finally and irrevocably seized the strategic initiative. If after Moscow it had only temporarily seized it, and after Stalingrad it had consolidated a radical turning point, then after Kursk, the Wehrmacht was never again able to plan and carry out large-scale strategic offensive operations on the Eastern Front. From then until the end of the war, the German army was forced to defend itself, retreat, and respond to Soviet attacks. It completely lost its freedom of choice. Secondly, the myth of the invincibility of the German army in summer conditions was finally dispelled. Until then, the Wehrmacht had been considered a master of summer campaigns and blitzkriegs. Operation Citadel was supposed to be further proof of this. Instead, it turned into a crushing defeat. The Red Army proved that it was not only capable of withstanding the Wehrmacht's summer attacks, but also of crushing its best elite divisions. Thirdly, the backbone of the Panzerwaffe, the German tank forces, was broken. The best tank divisions, equipped with the latest technology, were burned in the Kursk battle. Thousands of experienced tankers, who had taken years to train, were lost. Germany never recovered from this blow. Although it continued to produce new tanks, including the King Tiger, it was never able to achieve the level of combat effectiveness and skill of its tank units that it had before Kursk. Fourth, the victory at Kursk had a huge impact on the international situation and on the resistance movement in the occupied countries of Europe. It strengthened the anti-Hitler coalition by showing the Allies the power of the Red Army and the inevitability of Germany's defeat. This accelerated the decision to open a second front in Europe. For the enslaved peoples of Europe, the victory at Kursk was a ray of hope. a signal to intensify the struggle against the occupiers. Finally, the Battle of Kursk had enormous moral and psychological significance. For the Soviet people, it became a symbol of the ultimate victory of spirit and arms, confirmation that the enemy would be defeated. It instilled confidence in the imminent liberation of the entire country. For the German people and army, the defeat at Kursk was a harbinger of the coming catastrophe. Faith in the Führer and in victory was undermined. A slow but irreversible process of moral decay began. The Kursk Bulge became Hitler's last desperate adventure, his last attempt to turn back the tide of history. He risked everything he had and lost. From August 1943, the war rolled westward. Almost 2 years of fierce fighting lay ahead, followed by the liberation of Ukraine, Belarus, and Europe. But it was here, on the fields near Kursk, Belgorod, and Orel, that the final verdict was passed on the Third Reich. Here, the point of no return had been reached.